In a world carved from dust and bone, a poor black widow and her children found a starving white cowboy by the side of the road. They did not know then that this single act of mercy, this reluctant offering of water and shade, would be the first tremor of an earthquake that would shatter their world, only to rebuild it on a foundation they could never have imagined. They did not know he would one day ask to marry her, not in a whisper of romance, but in a roar of defiance against the very world that left him for dead. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And subscribe if you want more content like this one. The sun was a merciless god, and the earth it ruled was cracked and praying for a deliverance that never came. For Martha, deliverance was not a divine concept. It was the weight of the water bucket in her hand, the thinness of the stew in the pot, the quiet, rhythmic breathing of her two children, Samuel and Sarah, as they slept in the suffocating heat of their small cabin. Her life was a litany of survival, a prayer whispered in calloused hands and an aching back. Her husband, Joseph, existed now only in the phantom ache of his absence, a space at their small table that no amount of work could ever fill. It was Samuel who saw him first, a discarded shape by the roadside, almost indistinguishable from the withered brush and red clay. A man, a white man. The words were a clang of alarm in Martha's mind. Every instinct, honed by a lifetime of taught caution and bitter experience, screamed at her to turn away, to gather her children and retreat into the fragile safety of their isolation. He was not their problem. The world that had made him, and the world that had broken him, was the same world that had built its foundation on the breaking of her own people. Her first impulse was to leave him to the god of the sun he was baking under. But then, a sound, faint and broken, escaped his cracked lips. A whimper. It was a sound she knew. It was the sound of a life clinging to its last thread. A sound that transcended the color of his skin. A sound that spoke directly to the exhausted, weary, but stubbornly persistent humanity buried deep within her. She looked at her son's wide, questioning eyes and then back at the dying man. In that moment, the choice was not about black or white. It was about life or death, and she had seen enough death to last 1,000 lifetimes. With a sigh that carried the weight of generations, she pointed. "Samuel," she said, her voice raspy from the dust. "Bring the water." The man was a foreign weight in her home, a heavy, unsettling presence that seemed to soak up the very air. Laid out on her own thin cot, he was a map of suffering. His skin burned raw, his lips split and bleeding, his breath a shallow, ragged thing. Martha worked with a grim, detached efficiency, her movements practiced and sure. She washed his face with a damp rag, feeling the fever radiating from his skin like heat from a blacksmith's forge. The touch was impersonal, a duty performed, not an act of gentle care. In her mind, he was not a person but a problem, a danger she had foolishly invited across her threshold. Every glance at him was a risk assessment. Who was he? What trouble did he carry with him like a second skin? Men like him, in her experience, were either the source of violence or the victims of it, and either possibility was a threat to her and her children. Sarah, her youngest, peeked from behind the doorframe, her thumb in her mouth, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. Samuel, older and more aware of the world's harsh demarcations, stood rigidly by his mother's side, a silent miniature guardian of their tiny fortress. Martha could feel their fear, a palpable thing that added another layer to her own. She was their shield, and she had just brought a potential cannonball into the heart of their camp. She spooned a thin broth of water and cornmeal between his lips, watching the muscles in his throat struggle to swallow. It was food she could barely spare, a sacrifice that felt like giving away a piece of her own children's future. The cabin, her sanctuary, suddenly felt small, a cage she now shared with a predator she did not understand. As the sun bled out across the horizon, casting long skeletal shadows through the open door, the man's eyelids fluttered. His eyes, when they opened, were a startling, pale blue, cloudy with delirium. He tried to speak, but only a dry rasp emerged. He was a ghost, a specter from another world, and she, Martha, was now his unwilling anchor to this one. She didn't offer a word of comfort. She just watched, her face an unreadable mask, waiting for the threat to either fade or take form. His name, he finally managed to rasp out, was Silas. The name meant nothing to her. It was just a sound, a label for the danger sleeping in her cot. For days, he drifted in and out of consciousness, a fragile thing held together by her grudging care. When he was finally able to sit up, the space between them felt charged, a canyon of unspoken history and suspicion. Their first conversations were not conversations at all, but interrogations veiled in civility. "Where you from?" she asked, her tone flat, as she stirred the ever-present pot of stew. He hesitated, his pale blue eyes studying the dirt floor. "Here and there," he said, his voice still rough. The vagueness was a red flag, a confirmation of her deepest fears. Honest men had a place they belonged to. Men who said here and there were running, and men who were running were being chased. "Who's looking for you?" she pressed, not bothering to soften the question. He flinched, a subtle tightening around his eyes. "No one you need to worry about, ma'am." The ma'am was a piece of etiquette so out of place in her hard-scrabble world that it felt like an insult, a flimsy attempt to build a bridge over a chasm he could never comprehend. She turned to face him fully, wiping her hands on her apron. "Any trouble that finds you finds me. It finds my children," she stated, her voice low and cold. "I have a right to know." He looked away, toward Samuel and Sarah, who were playing quietly in the corner with dolls made of corn husks. He saw the way they watched him, with the same guarded curiosity as their mother. He was an intrusion, a disruption to their delicate ecosystem of survival. "It was a card game," he finally offered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "A misunderstanding." Martha let out a short, sharp breath that was almost a laugh. A misunderstanding. She knew that word. It was a word white men used to cover a multitude of sins, a word that often meant a black man was left hanging from a tree. She didn't believe him. Not for a second, but she didn't press further. The wall between them was built, stone by heavy stone, and his evasions were just the mortar setting it in place. She would feed him, she would let him heal, but she would not let him in. Her heart was a fortress, and its gates had been sealed shut long ago. The constant, quiet presence of Silas in her cabin began to unearth ghosts. As she watched him sleep, his breathing evening out, his fever finally broken, her mind drifted back to another man who had slept in that same cot, Joseph, her husband. The memory of him was sharp, a pain that time had failed to dull. She saw him not as a ghost, but as he was in life, strong, vibrant, his hands capable and gentle. She remembered the day they'd laid the foundations for this cabin, his laughter echoing in the vast, empty prairie. He had promised her not a mansion, but a sanctuary, a place where their love could take root and grow, sheltered from the bitter winds of the world outside. They had believed in that promise. They had watered it with sweat and sacrifice, nurturing it under the same harsh sun that now beat down on her alone. The flashback was vivid, a sensory assault. She could almost feel the rough texture of his shirt as they danced in the moonlight, the smell of sawdust and his skin, the deep rumbling sound of his voice telling her they would make it. He was her anchor, her partner in a world designed to break them apart. The memory then soured, as it always did, shifting to the day it all ended. It wasn't a dramatic showdown or a noble fight. It was a cough, a simple, persistent cough that grew into a monster, a sickness the town doctor refused to treat with anything more than a dismissive glance and a bottle of useless colored water. She had begged. She had offered their last few coins, but the doctor's door, like so many others, was closed to her. She had held Joseph's hand as the life drained out of him, his last breath a whisper against her cheek. He hadn't been killed by a bullet or a rope, but by a quiet, pervasive indifference that was just as deadly. That was the world she knew. It took without asking and gave nothing back. Wrenching herself back to the present, she looked at Silas, this stranger in her husband's place. The bitterness rose in her throat like bile. Joseph had died for lack of the most basic care, the care she was now giving freely to a white man, a man who belonged to the world that had let her husband die. The irony was a cruel, twisted blade in her gut. Her caution was not just caution. It was a scar, a deep, ragged wound left by the memory of a love that had been stolen from her. As Silas's strength returned, a new tension filled the small cabin. He could no longer just be a patient, a passive recipient of her charity. The unspoken debt hung in the air between them, thick and heavy. One morning, He rose before her, the sky still a bruised purple. When she emerged, she found him outside, studying the splintered post of the corral fence, a section that had been broken for months, a constant nagging reminder of her inability to do it all. He said nothing, simply picked up the heavy post-hole digger she hadn't had the strength to wield effectively, and began to work. The rhythmic thud of the tool striking the hard earth was a new sound, a masculine sound that hadn't been heard on this land since Joseph's passing. It was both jarring and, to her own deep consternation, strangely reassuring. Martha watched him from the doorway, her arms crossed, her face a carefully blank slate. She told herself it was suspicion, that she was watching for a sign of his true character. For the moment the pretense would drop, but a different feeling was stirring beneath the surface, a grudging respect. He worked with a quiet, focused intensity, his movements economical and sure. He didn't complain about the heat or the difficulty of the task. He just worked. When the fence was mended, solid and straight, he moved on to the leaky roof of the chicken coop, and then to the broken handle on the water pump. He was slowly, methodically, repairing the frayed edges of her world. His labor was a form of communication, a language more honest than the clumsy words they had exchanged. Each repaired plank, each driven nail, was a sentence. I am not a threat. I am earning my keep. I see what needs to be done. She could not bring herself to thank him. The words would not form. Acknowledging his help would be to acknowledge him as more than just a temporary problem. It would be to admit that his presence was, in some small, tangible way, a benefit. It was a crack in the formidable wall she had built around herself, and the light peeking through was both frightening and unfamiliar. He was still a stranger, a man with a past shrouded in secrets, but his hands told a different story. They spoke of capability, of contribution, of a silent, steady strength. The inevitable could not be postponed forever. Their supplies were dwindling to almost nothing, and a trip to the nearby settlement of redemption was necessary. The name of the town was a bitter joke Martha had never found funny. The journey was tense, the silence in the rickety wagon thick with unspoken anxieties. With Silas sitting beside her, she felt exposed. A spectacle. She was no longer just a poor widow. She was a poor black widow with a white man in tow. It was a combination that defied the rigid, unwritten laws of their world, an affront to the natural order as the townsfolk saw it. The moment they rolled onto the main street, the gazes began. They were sharp and pointed, coming from the shadowed doorways of the general store, from behind the dusty windows of the saloon, from the women gossiping over their laundry lines. Whispers followed them like a swarm of angry bees. Martha kept her eyes fixed forward, her back ramrod straight, but she could feel the heat of the town's collective stare on her skin. Inside the general store, the air grew cold. Mr. Abernathy, the proprietor, a man whose civility was always measured by the color of a customer's skin, served her with a clipped, dismissive air. His eyes kept flicking to Silas, who stood silently by the door, his presence large and unsettling. "That him?" Abernathy muttered, leaning over the counter. "The one you're keeping?" Martha met his gaze, her own eyes like chips of flint. "I'm keeping my children, Mr. Abernathy. The man is just passing through." The lie felt thin and useless. Later, as they were loading their meager supplies, Sheriff Brody approached, his hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol. He was a man who wore his authority like a shroud, suffocating everything in its vicinity. He tipped his hat, a gesture that held no warmth. "Martha," he said, his voice a low drawl, "just wanted to make sure everything is all right out at your place." His eyes slid over to Silas, cold and appraising. "We don't like unaccounted-for strangers. They bring trouble." The threat was clear, hanging in the dry air between them. Silas didn't speak, but he straightened to his full height, his stillness a form of defiance. In that moment, standing under the hostile gaze of the law, they were no longer just a woman and a man. They were a unit, a fortress of two besieged on all sides. Returning to the homestead was like retreating to a sheltered cove after weathering a storm on the open sea. But the tension from town had followed them home, a toxic residue that clung to the air. The world had shown its teeth, reminding them of the precariousness of their situation. That evening, after the children were asleep, A different kind of quiet settled over the cabin. It was not the hostile silence of their first days together, nor the busy silence of work. It was a shared quiet, heavy with the weight of the day's events. They sat at the small table, the flickering lamplight carving deep shadows on their faces. For the first time, Martha didn't feel the need to fill the space with chores or pointed questions. The shared experience in town had forged a strange, unspoken alliance. It was Silas who finally broke the silence, his voice low and gravelly. "I'm sorry for the trouble I've brought you," he said, his gaze fixed on the worn wood of the table. Martha shook her head, a small, almost imperceptible movement. "Trouble finds me whether you're here or not. It just has a different name now." There was no bitterness in her voice, only a weary resignation. He looked up, his pale eyes meeting hers in the dim light. "I wasn't entirely truthful," he admitted. "The card game, I was cheating. The man I was playing against was Sheriff Brody's brother." The confession hung in the air, a raw and vulnerable thing. It wasn't a full story, but it was a piece of the truth, an offering. Martha absorbed the information without surprise. It fit the jagged pieces she had already assembled. She found herself responding with an offering of her own, a truth she rarely shared. "My Joseph," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "He didn't die from a fight or a wound. He died from a cough because the doctor wouldn't see him. He said it wasn't worth his time." She hadn't intended to share it, but the words came out, a release of pressure from a wound that never healed. In that small, lamplit cabin, surrounded by a hostile world, two people from different sides of a great divide laid down their armor, piece by piece. They were no longer just black and white, woman and man. They were two souls marked by loss, finding a moment of quiet, profound understanding in their shared sorrow. The wall between them hadn't vanished, but a gate had opened, just a crack. The sky turned a bruised, angry purple, and the wind began to howl, a mournful cry that swept across the plains. A storm was coming, a physical manifestation of the turmoil that had been brewing between them. It descended with a furious violence, lashing the small cabin with sheets of rain and rattling the door in its frame. They were trapped, forced into an intimacy that was both terrifying and unavoidable. The children, awakened by the roar of the thunder, cried out. Sarah ran to Martha, burying her face in her mother's skirt. Samuel, trying to be brave, stood with his small shoulders squared, but his trembling lip betrayed his fear. It was Silas who moved first. He knelt, bringing himself down to the boy's level. "It's just the sky throwing a tantrum," he said, his voice a low, calming rumble beneath the storm's fury. "He'll tire himself out soon enough." He began to tell them a story, a fantastical tale of a cloud giant and a mischievous wind spirit. His voice wove a spell, creating a small pocket of safety in the heart of the tempest. Martha watched, mesmerized. She saw him not as a white man, an outsider, or a threat. She saw a man comforting her scared children with a gentleness and patience that stunned her. She saw a kindness in him that she had forgotten could exist. As the story wound down and the children's fear subsided into sleepy exhaustion, the cabin fell quiet again, save for the drumming of the rain. The space between Martha and Silas felt electric. The storm outside had stripped away all pretense, leaving them with the raw, undeniable truth of their connection. He looked at her, his eyes asking a question she was afraid to answer. The air was thick with things unsaid, with the magnetic pull of two lonely people who had found an unexpected harbor in one another. For a heart-stopping moment, the world shrank to the few feet of space between them. A line was about to be crossed, a boundary erased forever. But then a particularly violent clap of thunder shook the cabin, and the moment was broken. They pulled back, the fear of what they were feeling as powerful as the storm itself. The world outside and the world inside them were both in chaos. The morning after the storm was unnaturally still, the world washed clean and glistening. The air was fresh, filled with the smell of wet earth and a fragile, tentative peace. Felt like a new beginning, a clean slate. But the past was not so easily washed away. On the horizon, a cloud of dust appeared, and it was not from the wind. Martha's heart seized. She knew who it was. Sheriff Brody, and this time he was not alone. He rode up with a posse of 3 other men, their faces hard and grim. They reined in their horses, forming a semicircle in front of the cabin. a clear and deliberate act of intimidation. "Martha," Brody said, his voice devoid of any pretense of civility. "We've come for him." He nodded curtly at Silas, who had emerged from the cabin to stand beside her. "There's a warrant for horse theft in the next county." It was a lie, a flimsy excuse fabricated to assert his power. Everyone knew it. It was the law being bent into the shape of a weapon. Martha felt the old, familiar fear, the instinct to shrink, to become small and invisible, to placate and survive. It was a role she had played her entire life, but as she looked at Silas, at the quiet defiance in his stance, and then at her children peering from the doorway, something inside her shifted. A lifetime of swallowed anger, of silent endurance, finally found a voice. She took a step forward, placing herself between Silas and the sheriff. "He's done no wrong here," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "He's under my protection." The words once spoken seemed to solidify the very air around her. The sheriff's eyes narrowed with disbelief and fury. This was not how the game was played. He was about to retort, to escalate, when Silas moved. He stepped up beside her, not in front of her, but beside her. A partner. He looked directly at Brody, his gaze unwavering. Then he turned his eyes to Martha, and in front of the sheriff, his posse, and the entire watching world, he spoke, his voice ringing with a desperate clarity. "Martha," he said, his voice full of a raw emotion that transcended everything, "will you marry me?" It was not a proposal of love born in peace, but a declaration of war, a shield forged in the fire of their shared defiance. The sheriff's jaw went slack. The men behind him shifted uncomfortably in their saddles, their bravado momentarily punctured by the sheer, stunning audacity of the question hanging in the air. A proposal. A legal binding contract that would tie this white drifter to this black woman, creating a union that was anathema to their entire social order, yet one the law, in its own twisted way, would be forced to recognize. It was a checkmate. To arrest Silas now, to drag him away from his intended bride on a trumped-up charge, would create a complication, a potential scandal that even a man like Brody was hesitant to ignite. He stared at Silas, then at Martha's fierce, terrified, resolute face. He saw not two individuals, but a united front, an unforeseen fortress. With a curse spat into the dust, Sheriff Brody wheeled his horse around. "This ain't over," he snarled, but the threat lacked its earlier conviction. He and his men rode away, their retreat a cloud of angry, impotent dust. The silence they left behind was profound, broken only by the sound of Martha's own ragged breathing. She turned to Silas, her mind reeling, trying to process the cataclysmic event that had just occurred. The world had tilted on its axis. He hadn't run. He hadn't fought with his fists. He had fought for her, for them, with the only weapon he had left, a promise, a future. This wasn't a storybook ending. The danger had not vanished. It had merely retreated to the shadows, where it would likely fester and grow. The town would not suddenly embrace them. Their life would be a constant battle against whispers and glares, a daily struggle for their right to simply exist together. But as she looked at him, truly looked at him, she no longer saw the stranger she had pulled from the dust. She saw the man who had mended her fence, who had calmed her children in a storm, who had stood beside her against the world and offered her the ultimate protection he could conceive. The fear was still a cold knot in her stomach, but for the first time in a long time, it was not alone. Beside it, a fragile, tender, and impossibly stubborn seed of hope had been planted. Her gaze fell to his hand, then to her own. They were not yet touching, but they were close, hovering in the quiet space between a desperate question and its unspoken answer, ready to build a life from the wreckage.